That is, we don't think the Russians are going to make some sort of major breakthrough that fundamentally degrades Ukraine's ability to defend the territory that they have. They target the young in particular because they are the future generation. They hand out passports, they change their nationality status and the laws. They, of course, indoctrinate them in the public schooling system. They make these various different youth and patriotic educational organizations for children to participate in, to Russify them. And of course, under Russian law, because the Russians define occupied Ukraine as new regions of Russia, once these children, particularly the males, turn 18, they will become eligible for volunteering to join the Russian military, or involuntarily being told to join the Russian military through compulsory conscription, like all Russian males starting at age 18 must do. So this is really not surprising. It is systematic. It's intended to destroy the notion of the Ukrainian state, and it's really part of Putin's larger strategic plan to completely destroy Ukraine, both as a political entity and as a cultural entity.
Hello and welcome to Frontline. I'm Alex Dibble, Times Radio's Deputy Head of News. Today we are discussing the war in Ukraine with George Barros, the head of the Russia team at the Institute for the Study of War. The ISW has become a go-to source for updates on the conflict and is a well-regarded authority on the war in Ukraine. George Barros, welcome to Frontline.
Thanks very much for having me, Alex. Good to see you.
Good to see you too. I wondered if we could start with the strikes overnight on Russian border regions. Russia has claimed that it shot down a US Patriot missile over Kursk. How is Russia and indeed the US, perhaps more importantly, likely to react to the events overnight?
I don't find those particular events very noteworthy, to be honest. The Ukrainians have reportedly operated those systems in that part of the theater before. And more importantly, the Ukrainians are conducting, no kidding, bona fide attacks into Russia proper with homegrown Ukrainian weapon systems. I think the more interesting attack that happened overnight was when Ukrainian intelligence conducted a very long-range drone attack targeting the Engels Air Force Base, a strategic bomber air base over 300 miles from the international border. It's important for the Ukrainians to operate in Russia, to strike Russian targets and degrade Russia's military capabilities. And I think the Kremlin is going to take any opportunities it can to try to overhype and overplay the potential role of Western assistance in facilitating those strikes. But at the end of the day, Russia and Ukraine are combatants in a conventional war under the laws and norms of international armed conflict. Ukraine is well within its rights to strike legitimate military targets within Russia.
And there is this continuing insurgency, it seems, in the Russian border regions by anti-Kremlin Russian militias, seemingly backed by Ukraine. We're now hearing as well that a second town has been seized. What can you tell us about these particular attacks and this second town?
Yeah, I don't assess that that activity is likely to cause a major headache for the Russian military at this time. The pro-Ukrainian Russian volunteer forces conducted similar raids into that southern part of Russia, into Belgorod, last year, actually around May. Those didn't have a very lasting or permanent effect at that time, and I'm skeptical that the Russian command is that concerned about them this time around either.
One thing that perhaps these attacks do is push Russian troops here or there slightly back from the front line. Is that something that the Russian military is very easy to adapt to and sort of regroup and just come back very, very quickly?
Yeah. Well, for what it's worth, it seems that the Russian volunteer forces that have been operating in Belgorod and Kursk Oblast, they haven't been meeting very stiff resistance to begin with. So it suggests that the Russian posture at the time really wasn't all that beefed up. I think that the Russians very well could pivot to go ahead and reinforce those sections, and but we've not seen any evidence of them doing so yet. It'll be very difficult, I think, for those pro-Ukrainian Russian forces to sustain their operations for a long period of time. And they likely have a planned retrograde. They probably have a planned exfiltration as part of their operation. Their task doesn't seem to be to hold a certain amount of territory for a long time.
So we've spoken for a minute or two about these occasional incursions on Russian territory. Of course, the vast majority of the war is taking place on Ukrainian territory. what's your assessment at the moment of Ukraine's defensive operation as it stands today?
Yeah, right now the Russians have the initiative across the entire theater, all the way from the north in Kharkiv to Luhansk, Donetsk, and all the way down to the south in Zaporizhia and Kherson. The Russians are conducting attacks and offensive operations, and they continue to grind out small tactical gains every single day. Russian forces are able to dictate the time and place and intensity of attacks, and it's forcing the Ukrainians right now to be purely reactive to respond to Russian attacks. And I think the Russians are trying to pile on these offensive operations in order to whittle down Ukraine's combat potential by burning their manpower, by burning their resources, and also in order to further Russian information operations that the Ukrainians cannot win. Ukrainians right now, of course, they're on a starvation diet of aid. There are artillery batteries on the front that are observing Russian units already in their sights within their targeting grids, and they have to conserve ammunition because they do not have sufficient ammunition to be able to engage targets. And this is facilitating some Russian maneuver right now. If the Ukrainians are not critically resupplied sometime in the coming weeks, then the Ukrainians run the risk of potentially being overrun in some sectors of the front, and the Russians might make some breakthroughs. It's very important right now that the Ukrainians get that resupply from the United States and the allied coalition supporting Ukraine.
I mean, when you look at, the ISW has very helpfully lots of maps in its reports, and one thing that's quite clear is you see these, as you describe, these little incremental gains that Russian forces are making, with the odd little blue section that you highlight where Ukraine are trying to mount mini counteroffensives. Those mini counteroffensives, how successful are they being?
Sure. So if you look at our map right now, and today is March 20, 2024, all the blue that you see is pretty much previous blue territory that Ukrainians seized or liberated with their own counteroffensive operations last year in 2023. The Ukrainians haven't made any substantial gains really since October or September of 2023. And what we actually see now is the gradual Russian reversal of some of those gains. That said, I'm actually not that concerned about it because the Russian gains, they're quite small and they're tactical gains. That is, they pertain to the tactical level of war. We forecast that the Russians, barring any major departures from their current performance and the Ukrainian defensive performance, are unlikely to create any major operationally significant gains this year. By operational, I mean the operational level of war or the level of war at which campaigns are waged. That is, we don't think the Russians are going to make some sort of major breakthrough that fundamentally degrades Ukraine's ability to defend the territory that they have, that will unhinge Ukrainian defense in any sort of fundamental way, or really break the back of the Ukrainian military. If you look at the southern counteroffensive area in Zaporizhia near Robotine, for example, the Russians have been contesting that village that the Ukrainians liberated. That village is only about 5 or 6 kilometers from the initial Ukrainian front line of departure when they conducted their counteroffensive last summer. And frankly, the Russians have been able to get probably to at least half of the village at this point. But if they lose it, it's not that big of a deal because at the end of the day, it's a very small village, which by itself doesn't portend success or failure for either combatant. And the Russians will certainly try to overinflate the significance of the Ukrainians losing a village, which ultimately by itself is inadequate to be able to say who controls the whole region.
I was going to come back to speak to you about Avdiivka in a moment, but I just wanted to pick up on something you said there. So is the ISW's prediction that there won't be anything that Russian forces gain this year that will make an operational campaign difference? So if that's the case, why do you still believe, as you said a few minutes previously, that there is this huge urgency for Western aid to Ukraine if Russia won't make a gain of that nature this year?
Thank you. It's a contingent assessment. So I should have said this more clearly. If, assuming the condition holds true that ceteris paribus, the Ukrainians remain resourced and they have functioning artillery batteries and they're able to conduct all the regular activities that a military should be able to do when properly resourced, then the Ukrainians will be able to hold the line sufficiently and prevent any major breakthroughs. However, if the Ukrainians are not resupplied and their artillery batteries are all out of ammunition and their barrels that are shot through are not replaced, and if they don't have the supplies to be able to do the basic tasks that a military can do, then there is a growing risk that the Russians might be able to achieve a breakthrough this summer or this fall if the Ukrainians break. So that's why it's important. It's contingent on, do the Ukrainians get that critical resupply or not. My assumption, my walking assumption, and my money is still on the Ukrainians will receive that resupply. But of course, then my forecast, if the Ukrainians do not, will be invalidated.
That's helpful clarification. Thank you. We've had a military analyst in the UK suggesting that Russia might try to seize on its gains at Avdiivka and cut across the Ukrainian flank at Robotyne. Can you kind of explain the importance of this village and how much of a threat Russia does pose in that particular area?
Sure. So what we actually see right now in the Avdiivka area, and for listeners who are interested, you might consider looking up the map that we publish at ISW Interactive, one that you can pull up and pan and zoom to your desired scale. We see the tempo of Russian operations in Avdiivka rapidly decreasing following the seizure of the town back in mid-February. And now there's some fighting happening for the satellite villages to the west of Avdiivka, Berdishki, Tonkina, Orlivka. It seems that the Russians are contesting them. They've definitely captured more ground in that area, and they very well might capture those satellite villages. But we're not, at this moment, we're not concerned about the Russians being able to massively project further west of there anytime in the short period. By that, I mean probably within the next 2 to 3 months. The Russians are exhausted. As you know, they took horrific losses capturing Avdiivka. They lost at least 3 mechanized divisions worth of equipment in those attacks, and the tempo of operations has slowed. The Ukrainians are also digging in. They've generated field fortifications, and their main line of defense, which I'm not going to describe for Ukrainian operational security, it lies to the west of those 3 frontline villages, those satellite villages just west of Avdiivka. And we currently forecast that we think the Ukrainians should be able to hold that defensive line at this time. We don't think the Russians have the combat power to be able to project far across the southeastern flank to connect up with Zaporizhia. If the Russians were able to do that, I would be astonished, because it would be a major inflection in Russian performance. They've not demonstrated the ability to do long, dramatic drives that quickly since the beginning of the war in 2022, and therefore it would be a major departure.
We will actually come back in a moment to talk about what's going on with Russia, talking about them being exhausted and how they might be responding to that. But just while we're on the subject of attacks on Russia, we've had the ISW report on continuing sort of strikes and sabotage on Russian oil refineries, including drone strikes at Krasnodar Krai refinery last weekend. Again, we see that perhaps could be hitting production by about 7%. Is that right? And how significant are these attacks in the general context of the war?
Yeah, the attacks are quite significant. Number one, they've demonstrated a new Ukrainian strike capability to be able to use those homegrown, home-developed Ukrainian drones to be able to reach out and strike targets further in the rear. This is going to increase Russian costs to continue waging the war, because it means the Russians are going to have to invest less in the tip of their spear operating in Ukraine, but more in their own protection and defense of strategically critical infrastructure and facilities deeper into the interior of Russia itself. In terms of the strike specifically against the oil refineries, that in of itself is quite significant. Russia has 30 oil refineries, and as of our conversation today, the Ukrainians have either confirmed to have struck, or there have been unexplained fires at 14 of those 30 oil refineries. Around March 16th, the Ukrainians conducted a series of attacks against 3 oil refineries that reportedly by themselves process about 10% of Russia's annual refinement output per year, or 25 million tons of oil. Um, that, of course, is a big deal for the Russians because energy extraction is a pillar of the Russian economy, a pillar of their GDP. I think between April and June 2023, oil and gas accounted for 16% of Russia's gross domestic product. So by degrading their ability to refine oil and do resource extraction, it really does degrade the Russian economy. And it also degrades the calculus for the Russian elites who profit off of oil extraction and oil trade. It helps bring the cost of war closer to them. And of course, they have more agency when it comes to Russian decision making than, say, the unfortunate poor soldiers who come from impoverished and powerless families who are forced to go actually fight in Ukraine.
So more of an economic hit for now than a militarily catastrophic event, but something that could affect the military down the line.
Absolutely. It does also have military effects. Tanks require petrol. Trucks require petrol. The resourcing is very important. Russia has a lot of reserves, so I don't think it's going to majorly affect them in the immediate term. But it absolutely will degrade them if the Ukrainians can continue to degrade the Russian output capacity over time.
So let's talk now a little bit about what's happening within Russia, how Russia is responding to the latest developments. So we've had Vladimir Putin trying to sort of cast the image of Russian success recently, especially around his re-election. How would you assess Ukraine's efforts at the moment to sort of destabilize internal politics and internal issues within Russia?
Yeah, I'm not sure to what extent the Ukrainians are actively trying to sow destability within Russia, actually. They might be, but I'm not sure, and I'm not prepared to assess those efforts. What I will say is Vladimir Putin, for the course of his entire career as president of Russia, understands that I'm not sure if he understands it correctly, but he perceives that there is a risk of a groundswell movement, an organizational movement that could depose autocratic rule in Russia. Most Russian leaders either historically die in office or are deposed, either by the other strongmen in the cabinet or by their own populations. So Putin's very alive to this fact. And what he's done is he's erected what the Russians call the power vertical, the monolithic centralization of state power around the head of the Russian state, so that the Russian president can atomize the population, crush them, repress them, and also give them the illusion of choice while they're being repressed with fake candidates to vote for that are controlled opposition, fake parties that are controlled opposition parties, the semblance and the veneer of a free media with a variety of different TV channels and publications that all have slightly different editorial standards and lines that they go for, but at the end of the day are curated by Kremlin-controlled editors. So, I think Putin understands that quite well, and he's done a fairly effective and good job of maintaining that power. I think Russia will remain stable. I hope I'm wrong, but I think Russia will remain stable. We don't assess that there's any risk of a palace coup. Notably, the biggest threat to Putin throughout this whole time has not been from political groundswell from the masses, but rather from another strongman from inside the tent, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the former head of the Wagner Group, who, of course, conducted a mutiny last summer and subsequently was killed in the fall. So Putin's got it all under control, and he's tightening down the hatches and screwing everything down to be able to sustain his autocratic rule for as long as he has to.
You spoke a few minutes ago about the exhaustion that the Russian military is experiencing at the moment, and it has been pointed out that Putin was likely waiting until after his re-election to begin a new round of mobilization. How many more soldiers does Russia need, and will there be this new round of mobilization post-election?
Yep. So the Russians were suffering an acute shortage of combat personnel throughout late 2022. And the Russians launched a new line of effort to generate what they call so-called volunteers, which go and fight in Ukraine. We call that at the Institute the Russian crypto mobilization effort. This has been a tremendously successful effort, and the Russians, for the last several months, have now been generating an estimated 20,000 volunteers to go fight and die in Ukraine. This was not the case in 2022, when the Russian lines were quite thin. They didn't have sufficient reserves to do operational rotations. They can now do that now. And so actually, we think the Russian need for mobilization has decreased. There will likely come a time, especially after more intense fighting, and if the Russians seek to maintain a high tempo of offensive operations, that they might have to conduct another wave of mobilization. And we think that it's more likely that he'll do so now that he's after the elections. But mobilization is a fundamentally unpopular thing, and Putin seeks to avoid it at all costs. Putin will have to do one of two things will have to be true in our assessment before Putin conducts mobilization. Either number one, the Russian military will have to suffer some sort of catastrophic event, which degrades their forces substantially and requires a surge of fresh blood. We actually saw this back in September 2022, when the Ukrainians conducted their very successful Kharkiv counteroffensive, which was the preceding event which triggered Putin's decision to call mobilization for the first and only time so far in fall 2022. The second thing that could happen is Putin might decide that he fundamentally needs more combat power to achieve his objectives, sans there being any sort of catastrophic event. And he will have to conduct some sort of informational operation to market to the average Russian and to make sexy to the average Russian military service. We've not seen any indications of that major sustained effort yet, but that would likely be a leading indicator that Putin is preparing to condition his population for that mobilization. All that is to say, the Russians are basically okay. Putin wants to avoid that as much as possible, and the Russian machine is cranking out plenty of recruits just fine. In about a couple weeks here, at the beginning of April, we're going to begin into our annual or biannual Russian conscription cycle, when about 130 to 150,000 men will be called up, military-age men that will serve their 1-year mandatory service in the armed forces. By Russian law, they should not be involved in combat roles in Ukraine, and then they will enter the reserve. The Russians do this every single year, both in the spring and in the fall, and this generates a steady pool of people from whom to make contract professional soldiers that the Russians send to Ukraine, as well as to build up that reserve from which the Russians recruit and theoretically could tap for the mobilization.
Another element of Russian mobilization, which features in the ISW's recent reports in particular, is a slightly worryingly a use of cadet corps to militarize Ukrainian children, to be taught and told that Russia is pro them, and that they should grow up and fight for Russia. Tell us a little bit more about that. How is that working? Is that a plan that Russia has had for decades to do this, or is it just a recent thing? Tell us more.
Sure. I think it can be elucidating for readers to try to put themselves into the geopolitical worldview of Putin. He's written and spoken publicly about his geopolitical worldview for decades, and if you put the pieces together, it starts to make sense. Putin fundamentally does not believe that Ukraine should exist as a political state, and he believes that Ukrainians as a people with their own distinct cultural identity and language are a real people. Putin believes that the Ukrainian people are actually just Russians who have been duped and fooled into thinking that they're a unique identity, that they're a unique people and a unique nation, and that they basically speak a bastardized dialect of the Russian language. And he believes that it is Russia's moral imperative to reunite Russia with its lost people and its lost lands. And that is the driving impulse for Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Consequently, when the Russian military occupies what it describes as Russia's lost historical lands, and it reconnects with its lost historical people, it conducts a series of essentially planned, orchestrated measures to Russify the population to remove the notion of Ukrainianness from the people, and to try to brainwash them into thinking that they are indeed Russians. They target the young in particular because they are the future generation. They hand out passports, they change their nationality status and the laws. They, of course, indoctrinate them in the public schooling system. They make these various different, youth and patriotic educational organizations for children to participate in, to Russify them. And of course, under Russian law, because the Russians define occupied Ukraine as new regions of Russia, once these children, particularly the males, turn 18, they will become eligible for volunteering to join the Russian military, or involuntarily being told to join the Russian military through compulsory conscription, like all Russian males starting at age 18 must do. So this is really not surprising. It is systematic. It's intended to destroy the notion of the Ukrainian state, and it's really part of Putin's larger strategic plan to completely destroy Ukraine, both as a political entity and as a cultural entity.
And just to clarify, the RSW is saying that is the first group of Ukrainian cadets, is that right, that has just started in Russian occupied Ukrainian territory?
Yeah, it's the first reports of the, if I remember the report correctly, it is the first time that we've observed in open sources the bureaucracy footprint for the establishment and the creation of this cadet corps specifically for youth. But we've seen a whole lot of other very similar things before. The Russians establish summer camps and things like that, where children are sent specifically to study things that the Russians call, like, military patriotic values. All of these things serve the same purpose in practice.
As we sort of get towards the end of our conversation, I want to ask you about comments from Emmanuel Macron. They received obviously wide publicity about not ruling out NATO troops in Ukraine, but it was believed at the time that he might have been slightly isolated in those comments. Since then, we've had the Latvian foreign minister suggesting that actually they're potentially with Macron on this, and other Eastern European nations suggesting that behind the scenes, and the Elysee certainly suggesting that behind the scenes there is more of a support for the kind of thing he was saying. What's your assessment of how that will be going down in Russia, and how Russia might respond to that sort of rhetoric?
Sure. Well, what I suspect is going to happen is, if or when some coalition of the willing states who are willing to send some forces to Ukraine do so, I'm fairly confident that the Russians will not respond with a tactical nuclear weapon against any force in Ukraine, and I'm fairly confident they're not going to use a strategic nuclear weapon against any member of NATO. We actually kind of already have what the Russian response will be. Yesterday, the head of Russia's security intelligence service, their foreign intelligence service, the SVR, Sergei Narishkin, stated that if the French do indeed deploy any forces to Ukraine, then those will be priority targets for the Russian military, legitimate targets, and that they will try to take them out. Narishkin notably did not say that they were going to be targeted with nuclear weapons. Which I think is significant given all of the hullabaloo that the Russian state has generated over the past 3+ years about its supposed red lines. And of course, having NATO forces overtly in Ukraine is one of those red lines, among a litany of other things, including sending any more weapons to Ukraine. And the Russians have, of course, threatened us being NATO, with nuclear blackmail at every turn. The Ukrainians have systematically demonstrated that the Russian nuclear blackmail threats are all hollow, because the Ukrainians have explicitly transgressed every single one of those red lines. I think if Macron does so, Ukraine is a sovereign state who can welcome in whatever forces it wants to. France and any coalition of the willing are sovereign states that are allowed to do whatever it so wants. I think that it's fundamentally good because it introduces elements of strategic deterrence. It introduces elements of uncertainty for Putin's calculus and decision making. And the fact of the matter is the current approach, which has been heads of state and NATO telling Putin what they will not do. We will not send forces to Ukraine. We will not react in a certain kind of way. That gives Putin complete transparency on, oh, okay, so that means I can do all the things that I want to do up until this point. And that's not a strategically smart way to go about this. Furthermore, no one's talking about the French sending French or allied NATO troops to go conduct combat operations in Ukraine. Right now, the current discourse is about the French potentially sending forces to do demining and also to cover the northern Ukrainian border with Belarus, where there's not been any active fighting for almost 2 years now, and potentially to help cover the Dnipro River, which forms the front line, which would be actually quite good for the Ukrainians, because right now there are Ukrainian units and brigades and battalions that are covering the northern border with Belarus. Though there are no significant Russian forces there, you still need to have a defensive posture. And if they were able to be relieved by a French and combined or joint allied force, that would free up those Ukrainian brigades and battalions to go ahead and reinforce where the actual real fighting is happening in the east and in the south, and give those exhausted Ukrainian forces the rotation that they need. So I see it as a positive thing. I think the Russians are going to make a big stink out of it, and when and if it does happen, we will very notably not have Armageddon.
It goes without saying there's a lot more we could discuss. It's a complex conflict, and it's been very, very valuable to get your thoughts. As I said at the start, the Institute for the Study of War has really become a go-to source for these regular updates on the conflict, and we appreciate you joining Frontline to give us your assessment of all these matters. So thank you very much for joining us.
Always a pleasure to speak with you, and thank you very much, Alex.
Thank you for taking the time to watch today's episode of Frontline from Times Radio, our podcast dedicated to defence and security. For more, do listen to the Times World in 10 podcast, where we look at not just defence and security, but all global matters, the important ones that you need to know. That is the Times World in 10 podcast. For now, though, thank you again for your time, and we'll see you soon on Frontline. Do remember to subscribe for more from Frontline and from Times Radio.